What the fuck are you talking about, Ian? Which, personally, I think that's stupid. You can scour through the entirety of the game canon for the franchise, and you'll see that it simply doesn't exist. Can be easily explained through one simple phrase: plot hole. So what we're actually saying is that Shadow can warp a whopping 240,000 miles away.
To the Eggman Empire. Authorization approved. Access granted.
What is happening, Tooties and Fruities? My name is KotyTang. And so we finally arrived at episode 3 of Dark Beginnings. And, there's honestly not too much to talk about for this one. Looks like we'll have to wait until the game comes out for the actual confirmation of all my theories. And I guess that's okay. What's another 2 weeks of waiting to see what happens, am I right? Dark Beginnings doesn't really have an ending because it leads directly into the games. So anyway, let's discuss. It's nice to see Honest Abe here again as an adult after all these years of Gun just pretty much not existing at all since Sonic 06. I mean, his character appears to have done a full 180. This is not how he acts in the game toward, well, anybody. He's a commander that never showed anything past a strict sense of duty, except toward the president, and when he was proven wrong about Shadow, where he was slightly less of an uptight prick in both instances. So it seems there's been a shift in who this character is over the years. And speaking of years, shouldn't this dude be retired by now? Black Doom was likely his final year as commander, but I guess he can just go on for however long the story needs a commander for Gun. He's about to die soon anyway by Dr. Eggman to the events of Sonic Forces, so it's not a big deal, I suppose. Let him have all of his regrets and change of tone until his final moments. I guess he deserves it? Now, he didn't fire Rouge for the destruction of millions of dollars in gun assets.
And aided in the destruction of millions in gun assets.
As well as what is essentially Team Dark launching an entire rocket ship into space. Alright, Abraham. Man to man, we gotta talk about this. Rouge has gotta be fired. I get it. She's a sexy piece of extravagant, thick, bat ass. She's probably great for everybody in Gun to stare at and keeps morale high. But you gotta get all of that ass out of here. Abe, you're letting her get away with double jeopardy here. She's a double agent on your ass. At the drop of a dime. Or just a simple question from Shadow. She will go right back and raid an entire base, costing you millions of taxpayer dollars. She's gotta go. Speaking of Gun, I'm glad that they got this guy out of the gunship in time. That would have been pretty brutal to think about this man exploding like that. And it would make it harder to believe that Abraham was just cool with Shadow murdering somebody and Rouge assisting. Well, unless he just doesn't care about Lieutenant Joe Bob and was cool with watching him die like that. Oh, and did anybody else notice that Kirk Thornton gave us one of the worst deliveries of Chaos Control in the century?
Chaos Control!
Yeah. And Rouge doesn't sound distressed at all here.
Omega, hurry! You have to take out those guns!
So I guess those multiple takes they're allowed to give now just did not pay off for either of them. Shifting over to the emo kid, Shadow is still haunted by his feelings for Maria, which is interesting because from all we've seen so far, he was pretty much over that. But then again, when have we ever got a story centered around Shadow after 06? And he merely threw away his past in Shadow 05. He never got over it. If anything, he just stated he was gonna ignore it. And as we all know, the best way to handle trauma is to just sweep it under the rug. In Shadow 05, Shadow only got informed of his past again. Which is why it was surprising that he remembered so much in episode 1 of Dark Beginnings. It's not like he was free of amnesia. Either way, Shadow never actually addressed his past, ever. And even then, I suppose, in the end, you're not really ever over all of your trauma, are you? And eventually, something is gonna spark it back up again. The fact that Shadow is still haunted heavily by Maria makes it harder to argue that everything he does isn't entirely for her, especially when it comes to the promise the two made together. While it's evident that Shadow did choose to align with Maria's values in the end, you could imagine that if Shadow ever wronged a human, then afterward, once he finally got a second to himself, he'd become overcome by genuine regret, as that isn't something Maria would have wanted him to do. So, in the end, as revealed in Dark Beginnings, Shadow has never truly escaped his past and the powerful hold that Maria had on him. And he likely never will. I also wonder what this means for Sega's direction of Shadow. Is he returning to what he used to be? Or are Ian and Izuka at war? To me, it looks like the Shadow I know is returning. And just like Sonic, he's still doing things his own way. Just as I explained in the last video, this is the Shadow that's always been. When we look back on how Shadow has been for the past decade, this is what people have been missing about why people actually love Shadow's character. He's more than just the guy that stands in the background and occasionally throws a middle finger up for no reason. And of course we get this heartbreaking montage of Shadow and Maria. It's good stuff. Sadly, there is nothing much to this episode. Shadow fights Gun, gets a ship, thinks about Maria, roll credits, wait for the game. However, outside of these episodes, a major topic that's been brought up since Dark Beginnings began is whether or not Shadow can in fact warp to the Ark. And now Ian Flynn's apparent understanding that chaos control only stops or slows down time. First, we'll address whether Shadow can in fact warp to the Ark. The obvious answer is no, and chaos control has never been shown to perform this feat. That is, outside of a super form and Black Doom, who is as strong as a super form. As a writer myself, I feel like I have a different sort of take on things like this. So the obvious elephant in the room that I need to address is first going to take place in Sonic Adventure 2. After Shadow leaves Sonic for the first time, Shadow magically appears on the Ark. Yet we're shown that the only way up there is through a teleporter inside of Eggman's base. The next one is going to be Shadow saving Rouge. And then again, they later appear on the Ark. This can be easily explained through one simple phrase: plot hole. So, first, in no instance ever of Shadow using chaos control has it ever displayed him performing a feat as great as teleporting to the Ark. You can scour through the entirety of the game canon for the franchise, and you'll see that it simply doesn't exist. Even in Sonic Adventure 2 itself, it never showed that Shadow chaos controlled onto the Ark. If the story was written to display that, then the first time you see Shadow appear on the Ark, it's supposed to be written as a, huh? Now, how did he get up there moment? Which would then be followed later on by Shadow saving Rouge on the island, and then we witness them warp to the Ark. Yet, that doesn't happen. There are exactly 0 scenes of Shadow ever teleporting to the Ark, or even an implication that that's how he got there from him. Because he never did. He never teleported to the Ark. What everybody is doing is actually trying to reason with a plot hole. But that's the problem. It's a plot hole. There is no reasoning. It's a mess up of the writers. At the very least, it's an extremely poorly planned plot point that never gets expanded upon. I understand the assumption, and it absolutely makes sense, but it doesn't account for how chaos control is not only performed, but also how it's always been shown to work. I could show hundreds of examples of chaos control only warping a short distance. You cannot show me any example of chaos control warping 600 miles away. Which is why when people argue that chaos control can send Shadow all the way to the Ark, it's an assumption. There is no evidence supporting any of that. Which leads me to the second point. The furthest we've ever seen somebody warp also took place in Sonic Adventure 2. And it's important to note that it was a desperation thing. And with that desperation, it's going to strain the limits of what would normally be capable because you're straining yourself. I'm gonna be overly generous here and say that Shadow successfully warped off of the island. So we'll say the furthest Shadow can warp would be around 36 miles, which would likely be the length of this whole island. Obviously, Shadow and Rouge would have had to have warped off the island, otherwise they'd be dead. And then they regroup with Eggman and head back to the Ark, where Shadow and Rouge share a moment together. It never shows Shadow warping onto the Ark. You would assume that would be the next scene, as all of them collectively teleporting in. But it's actually a passage of time, as Eggman is confirmed to have been in the background already working on something. I have a theory about how chaos energy works, but for brevity's sake, I'm just gonna say that Shadow is pumped full of chaos energy and Black Doom's DNA, so he is so far the only character besides Black Doom that will ever achieve a 36-mile-long chaos control warp. That is an incredible feat, not just something that he does for fun. Everybody else would be significantly weaker when using chaos control. It's likely they couldn't even get up to a dozen miles. Which adds up with Shadow being more adept with chaos powers than others. So if we look toward him warping into space now, in order to just break through the sky, that would put him at about 30 miles shy of space, which would be at about 62 miles up, okay? So let's go a bit deeper, because now we have to get through Earth's atmosphere. The International Space Station orbits at about 250 miles above Earth, while the Hubble telescope hovers at approximately 340 miles from Earth. Now the Space Colony Ark is far larger than pretty much anything we have thrown up in space right now. And from every shot we see, it's quite a distance from our planet. I'd imagine it's a good 400 to 600 miles away. Or we even could drop it at around 340 miles. So the assumption from anybody arguing this is that Shadow can warp at least 340 miles at any time as long as he has a Chaos Emerald. And if we really want to get crazy, in Dark Beginnings, the Space Colony Ark actually orbits the moon. So what we're actually saying is that Shadow can warp a whopping 240,000 miles away. I implore every single person watching this video to show me a single time where Shadow has warped like either of those instances on screen, and then explain to me why Shadow never does this in relation to anything going on in the world. Now there are two exceptions to chaos control to consider, and I think it completes the picture of what I'm saying. And that's Black Doom and Super Shadow. Black Doom was able to use the Chaos Emeralds to warp the Black Comet onto Earth. Granted, he needed all 7 to bypass its atmosphere, but afterward, Super Shadow was able to chaos control the Black Comet right back into space. What seems to be the case from just analyzing these scenes is that the greater hold you have on chaos energy, the greater chaos control will also become. So, what that means is that while Shadow himself cannot warp directly to the Space Colony Ark, Super Shadow absolutely could. The next step to this would be to give a facetious argument. Is chaos control unlimited? How many times can Shadow warp successfully? We've seen him do it successively at least twice, so we know it can be done more than once. So could Shadow theoretically warp again, and then again, and again, until he's successfully gone to the Ark? Well, you'd also have to answer why Shadow doesn't just always use chaos control when he fights somebody. There must be some sort of limit that has never been expounded upon. All we have are examples from across the franchise for clues. The final thing to think about would be dimensional and timeline jumping. That's a whole video itself, but to briefly touch on that, Shadow isn't traveling any sort of distance to do that. He's actually staying in place, but creating a shift in reality. In Sonic Rush and Sonic 06, this maneuver creates a portal, and somebody goes through the portal. They don't just appear in another plane of existence. Without entering the portal, of course. By using chaos control in that instance, they create a distortion in space and time, which creates a portal. So now let's look at Ian Flynn's understanding of chaos control. Thanks to this bumblekast,
in IDW Sonic, the Warp Topaz was deemed the better for range travel to chaos control, Which makes me beg the question, how far can Chaos Control warp?
Because it doesn't really warp. It stops space-time, so it appears that you're warping.
Over there. That's how far.
I guess it just depends on how fast you can run once you manifest Chaos Control.
I guess.
I mean, in Shadow's case, it's a pretty sincere distance, and in my case, it'd probably be like 5 feet.
And this tweet, we can see that the crowned writer has a lack of understanding to one of the most common things in all of the Sonic franchise. In short, Chaos Control does both. It warps and it stops time. So from a writing standpoint, what would make the most sense to me about Chaos Control? I'd say Ian kind of gets it half right, but him and you guys are missing something important, and that's to think about what it would look like when Shadow warps. What makes the most sense to me is that when Shadow uses Chaos Control, not only is time halted or slowed, but Shadow is also propelled forward in an ethereal space, where he doesn't collide with anything. He just phases through whatever is in his way. It would explain how he always knows where he's going, doesn't have to worry about how to get around something, and he doesn't have to know the exact location of where he's gonna be. Chaos Control simply allows whoever uses it to fly themselves over in the limited time that they have. I imagine it would even be the same speed regardless of the person, but everybody has a different level of control for Chaos abilities. So in Shadow's case, he would be able to stay the longest in that time space. I don't think this has ever been displayed better than in Shadow's own game, where Chaos Control is used to speed through a level. I imagine this is what Shadow actually sees. He isn't just teleporting to a location, he's guiding himself to it. It's also the case that Shadow can also just simply stop time, according to 06, which personally I think that's stupid. It should just warp how I described. And when it comes to objects, you're probably at risk of causing a lot of destruction by warping something that you can't necessarily control. So it's smart to kind of have a hand and warp yourself with the thing, which is what Shadow does to protect the planet, and Black Doom does not do because he does not care about the planet. Now you can go as far as you want in the franchise to debunk Ian's claim that it only stops time, but really we don't have to look any further than the source of Chaos Control itself, Sonic Adventure 2. Sonic uses Chaos Control and it warps him. Apply what I said earlier about it dragging Shadow, and you can see that Sonic was just able to guide his body back to the Ark. If Sonic literally used it to warp out of a pod set to explode, you're not going to be able to argue that Sonic just stopped time, somehow got himself out of the pod, floated his way back into the Ark, where he materialized through the Ark inside of a random hallway with Knuckles. What the fuck are you talking about, Ian? You're the guy writing these stories. Please be more informed. And when somebody corrects you, I fully expect you to research into what they're talking about and don't try to deliver this shitty defense where you literally realize mid-tweet that Sonic teleported himself and then have the stupidity to still press send on that tweet. Genuinely, if that's how you're gonna respond to criticism, you should be labeled as a fucking hack. If you're wrong, own up to it and say you're wrong. Literally nobody worth an ounce of respect is gonna shit on you for being wrong and admitting it. But those same people will shit on you for doubling down, and you absolutely deserve it at that point. If you're gonna fake out a debate with the audience and try to prove your knowledge, then you best bring in your evidence, because they're gonna do the same and you're gonna look like an idiot. I just really wanna hammer in the fact that Ian literally had a revelation in public. He realized that Sonic warped out of the pod in the middle of writing his response and still sent the tweet mid-realization. And he even took it a step further. He then started acting like that was a plot hole. This man has the most random, uninformed position about Shadow, and he just shotgunned that out into the world like we were all gonna agree with him. Meanwhile, the only evidence he provides is a contradiction to his stance by bringing up Sonic escaping from the pod. That actually irks the hell out of me. What kind of official writer would tweet out something so wrong and uninformed and then double down? He's just loud and wrong at that point. Like, bro, you are the writer. This is information you need to know. And as you made it clear, you absolutely didn't know. I feel like that pretty much shows the type of person he is. You cannot criticize or correct this man on anything. And if you do, it'll probably take years for him to finally accept it. And even then, he's not gonna acknowledge that he had his continuity corrected by the community. Love what you're doing in Dark Beginnings, but you've gotta humble the shit out of yourself. You can't just be wrong and loud. You've gotta provide the evidence as to why you're right. Speaking of continuity, let's talk about the intel that Rouge had for Gun literally being the Time Eater, which would mean that the Time Eater was already active at this point. But we know, thanks to Sonic Generations, that Eggman didn't launch his attack on time until a few minutes after Sonic arrives to his birthday party. So let's look at this and consider the possibility that Eggman did indeed already have all of this in motion, and they simply hadn't grabbed anybody yet. I suppose it's possible that the Time Eater was actually worked on prior, but the fact that Gun got wind of something Eggman was up to is even crazier. And how would Rouge have found this inside of a supply depot? I suppose we're using the Sonic IDW version of logic here, where there's an eggnet, and the entire eggnet is just one massive computer where every single file is stored on the cloud server, which can be accessed from any computer. And we're also borrowing Eggman's pure stupidity when it comes to the defenses of the base, as nothing is encrypted, and Rouge just gives a flash drive to the Gun commander, and we see the Time Eater. All of this data in the IDW Eggnet can be accessed from any computer out of any base, which of course would make it even more contrived that Rouge went to this specific base rather than just any Eggman base in the world for this information. I really have to wonder, what exactly caused Gun to find out that Eggman was up to something? Were there ripples felt throughout the planet? Did the sky change to a weird color and then turn back? Now, it's definitely likely that Gun regularly looks into what Eggman has been up to. However, this one was much more specific. It's as though they knew long beforehand that Eggman was up to something, and they were specifically seeking out what it was. I guess we'll never find out. Now, it's not outside the realm of possibility that Eggman didn't immediately use the Time Eater to steal everybody away, and instead he first grabbed himself from the past, and then he began devising a plan. While it does feel wrong that there would be a possibility that the Time Eater would be known about, on the other hand, there's no reason to believe that Eggman didn't take it back to his lab. And within his first test with it, he grabbed the younger him to do even more planning around it. See, this is why I actually appreciate people like Ian Flynn expanding these ideas directly through the games. This is no longer an IDW retcon that is likely never going to be brought up again. This is pure canon. Every single thing Ian does with this game is going to be etched into the history of Sonic, and everybody will know about it. So him going back and detailing the extremely lackluster details of the poorly thought about Sonic stories as a whole is actually something I'm fine with, so long as it continues to make sense. I don't think it makes sense that Gun would know about the Time Eater, so I don't know what the hell Ian was going for there. I guess he just needed Rouge to obtain some sort of intel to link her to Shadow, even if it creates a extremely contrived right scenario where Shadow meets up with Rouge and Omega. But we also didn't need a direct link to Sonic Generations, as we already had Black Doom's return. Rouge obviously didn't go over this intel, as she didn't know anything about what was going on in the game once she was saved by Sonic. She even mentions that the Time Eater is like nothing she's ever seen before.
The thing that snatched me was like nothing I've ever seen before.
It's extremely questionable about what the intel that Rouge even received even expanded upon. It could have just been this creepy shot of the Time Eater, and that was it. But you'd imagine that Rouge the spy would be informed if she was ever tasked to further explore what's going on here. But oh well, I guess. She's got a birthday party to go to after all. Time to wait for the game for more unanswered questions. Like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join the Discord below, okay, bye!